George Rainey. George Rainey, 6 June 1799 June 1863, was a Scottish merchant, slave owner and land owner. In the early 1800s, Rainey became involved in sugar plantations in the Caribbean, which were worked by African slaves in Demerara in Guyana. Due to extensive family connections, he eventually became a full partner in Sandbach, Tin and Company, a Scottish-run company which dealt in trade in the same field and was prominent in British Guiana, to the extent that the men who ran it were called the Rothschilds of Demerara on account of their wealth and influence. After the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade in the British Empire in the 1830s, Rainey became involved in the Highland Clearances. Using monies from the payout to former slave owners following the Slavery Abolition Act 1833, he purchased the islands of Rosse, Rona, and Flada from Clan MacLeod in 1846. He removed from the land 12 townships of 94 Gaelic Highlander families to make way for sheep farming, causing mass depopulation and Biography. Background: George Rainey was born to Reverend George Rainey 1734–1810, a Presbyterian Church of Scotland minister in Crike, Sutherland, Scotland, and his wife Anne Robertson. His grandfather had been John Rennie, a farmer in Turriff, Aberdeenshire, Scotland. Among George's siblings were Margaret Rainey 1774–1844, who married to Charles Parker 1771–1828, from a Scottish family in the colony of Virginia, and a major player in Sandbach, Tin and Company, which ran sugarcane plantations in Demerara, Guyana. In addition to this, there was a brother, Gilbert Rainey 1782–1808, who had gone to Berbice, Guyana, to engage in the same trade. Harry Rainey, the noted pathologist and professor of forensic medicine at the University of Glasgow, was another brother, making George Rainey the uncle of Robert Rainey, a Scottish Presbyterian divine for whom Rainey Hall in New College, Edinburgh, is named. Plantations in Guyana. George Rainey followed his brother Gilbert Rainey into the sugar trade in Guyana. He became associated with the Scottish-dominated, Liverpool-based company Sandbach, Tin and Company. This company had been founded in 1790 when his uncle George Robertson, who had been trading in Grenada, and his future brother-in-law Charles Parker joined with Samuel Sandbach and the Demerara merchant James McInroy 1759–1825 to create what was originally known as This business had been described as the Rothschilds of Demerara in the 1820s. It would become one of the most successful trading companies in the Caribbean, dealing with sugar plantations in the Caribbean which were worked by African slaves. These families created strong connections to each other through marriage. By the time that George Rainey joined the company as a partner in Liverpool, it had become Sandbach, Tin and Company. According to the Journal of J.C. Chevely, who visited in 1821, the estates in Demerara containing the slave-worked sugar plantations were heavily mortgaged to Sandbach, Tin and Company. He stated that many estates which were mortgaged out had to rely on the company for shipping out sugar on ships owned by them through their agents in Guyana and Britain. According to the Legacies of British Slave Ownership at the University College London, Rainey was awarded a payment as a slave trader in the aftermath of the Slavery Abolition Act 1833 with the Slave Compensation Act 1837. The British government took out a £15 million loan worth £1 46 billion in 2022 with interest from Nathan Mayer Rothschild and Moses Montefiore, which was subsequently paid. Rainey had a large number of primary and secondary claims, 30 in total. Rainey owned 2793 slaves in Guyana and received a £146,295 payment at the time worth £14 2 million in 2022. Some Scottish newspapers, such as the Sunday Post, have claimed that Rainey received the largest payout of all the slave owners. The largest plantations which Rainey owned in Guyana were Leonora, Zealandia, La Jalausie, and Fellowship, among others. Highland Clearances. As the Atlantic slave trade and the triangular trade associated with it was brought to an end, Rainey returned to Britain. In 1846, George Rainey bought the islands of Rosse, Rona, and Flada, a group of islands in the Gatehill Tatched, between the Isle of Skye and the mainland of Scotland. The island had been ruled by Clan MacLeod of Rosse for several centuries, but had declined in the aftermath of their clan rallying to the standard of Charles Edward Stuart in the Jacobite Rising of 1745. The last laird, John MacLeod, was deep in debt and chose to emigrate to Tasmania, having sold Rosse for 35,000 guineas to Rainey. During this period, with the decline of traditional culture in the Scottish Highlands, many land speculators and landlords moved in to improve the estate. The main purpose of this was to clear the native Highland Gaels from the lands, either to urban centres in Great Britain or abroad to North America and Australasia, to make way for sheep farming. This was known as the Highland Clearances. When Rainey came to control Rosse, he set about implementing this process on the island and has been described as a cruel landlord who epitomized the horror of the clearances. There had been a steady drip of emigration from the island in the previous 2 decades, but when Rainey came to control the islands, this went into overdrive. Donald MacLeod, born 1805, a crofter from Tarran, Rosse, provided testimony to the Napier Commission on 22 May 1883 in regards to abuses under Rainey's tenure at Rosse. He stated that when Rainey came to control the island, he enacted a rule that nobody should marry on the island, so that the local natives could not reproduce their population. This has been described as a measure of control reminiscent of the slave plantations. MacLeod described an incident where a man by the name of John MacLeod decided to marry contrary to Rainey's ruling, and to make an example of him, he was removed from his father's house, then fled to stay in a sheep-cot, but that was set on fire as well, and none of his friends or anybody else would dare to give him shelter for the night. Rainey cleared 12 townships of their inhabitants in total to set up sheep farming, with 94 Highland Scots families forced from the island, causing mass depopulation and displacement. The Scottish poet and Rosse native Sorley MacLean authored the Scottish Gaelic poem Halaig about the Rainey years on Rosse. Personal life. George Rainey was married 3 times, firstly to Margaret Jessie Louisa Darroch, the daughter of Lieutenant General Duncan Darroch, 2nd Baron of Garroch from the Glengarry Fencibles. She died without issue in 1840. After this, Rainey took Elizabeth Haygarth as his second wife. She was the daughter of Reverend George Haygarth. She died in 1856. The couple did have a child together, Rainey's one and only son, George Haygarth, Rainey 1845–1872. He died in his 20s without issue. Thirdly, Rainey married Isabella Rudlin, the widow of the Reverend George Hingston. No issue came from this marriage. After the death of George Haygarth, Rainey, the trustees of his estate disposed the Rainey-controlled lands in the Inner Hebrides in favour of George Grant Mackay of Rosehall and Oban. George Rainey had 2 daughters who were born in Demerara. They returned with him to England in 1837, and later the sisters emigrated to Australia.